Hello, everyone, and my name is Brian, and today my goal is to talk to you about some of the major artistic movements that are happening in the United States during the middle part of the 20th century. For it's during this time when we have the transition of the center of the art world moving from Europe, and more specifically Paris, where it was, to the United States, particularly New York, where it will be. And this has its roots in the Armory Show from 1913. The Armory Show, for the first time, introduced modern art to the United States. Um, and during the decades that followed, New York became the center of the art world. Some would suggest that it's still there, although it might be moving even further west, all the way to the east in places like Tokyo. But for the time being, we're gonna think about the middle part of the 20th century. And in order to really embrace and understand and wrestle with that, we can't talk about Jackson Pollock and we can't talk about Mark Rothko, the artist whose work you see here, without really understanding what was happening before them. If I have a goal today, my goal isn't to have you like Jackson Pollock's work or even Mark Rothko's work, but rather understand why it's so important and why what they were doing was so novel, even in the middle of the 20th century. So, because I want you to understand Jackson Pollock, I want you to understand where he came from. And in order to get that, I want to show you this guy right here. This was an American painter by the name of Thomas Hart Benton. And Thomas Hart Benton is a great example of what we call in art history regionalism. And this was an artistic movement primarily in the 20s through the 40s of art in America being about a particular place. Benton was from the American Midwest. He was actually from Missouri, is perhaps the most famous artist ever from Missouri. And he began painting in this regionalistic style and carried it through with him even when he moved to New York and began teaching at the Art Students League. It's there where he has the biggest impact upon mid 20th century American art makers. And I want to give you this composition on the left, his Persephone from 1939. Now, we've looked at a Persephone before, and you at least should remember the story of Persephone. Persephone was the Greek or the Greek goddess who was frolicking around and drugged down into the underworld by Pluto. And when she comes up, everything grows, and when she goes back down, everything dies. And so Persephone has often been a symbol of spring and therefore of the fecundity of American agricultural life. I mean, the American Midwest is perhaps justifiably proud of the important role they play in the United States in terms of food. I mean, I lived in Iowa for a decade, and before I got to Iowa, I got to tell you, um, I never gave much thought in terms of where stuff comes from. And then I moved to Iowa, and I got to tell you, there's a lot of things that people in Iowa are proud of. But number one on that list, I suspect, is corn. And I like corn just fine. Of all the vegetables, I suppose I like it more than most. But every year in the early part of July, at least in Dubuque, one of the things people get really excited about is Finsel's sweet corn. And when we think about the American Midwest, we think about agriculture and farming. It's the American breadbasket, right? All of the stuff that's grown in places like Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, Indiana, and even further south. I know Louisiana is justifiably proud of soybeans or whatever it is we grow down here. So this painting is about the Midwest, and Thomas Hart Benton is working within a tradition of American art, and it's not important that you know this art maker, and I flipped this on its side. But one of the things American art does not do well is naked women. I mean, you might not think so, but you'll have to take my word for it because I'm old and smart. The United States is a remarkably prudish country. And if you need evidence of this, all you need to do is watch commercials from Europe or Mexican soap operas, and you will understand how Puritan we are. There's only really three great female nudes in the history of American art, and the first one is this one on the right. It's John Vanderlyn's Ariadne asleep on the island of Naxos from 1814. I wrote a book on American portraiture, and Vanderlyn was one of four guys I talk or write about. So I flipped her on her side, but you can get an idea of, like what Benton has kind of done is taken this image, rotated her 90 degrees. Here we have it, perhaps one of the great female nudes in the history of American art, with this creepy farmer guy looking over her shoulder, and she sort of fit into this agricultural landscape. This is a great example of regionalism, that Benton is embracing the ideas of the Midwest, both in terms of the farmer and agriculture, and into the farming way of life. And another art maker who does that same thing is Grant Wood. Now, a few artifacts ago, when we were talking about the Dutch Baroque, I said to you that the Night Watch is perhaps the national Dutch image, and that kids their whole lives have known about about the Night Watch. And I often wonder if there's an American equivalent, and I don't know, but if there is, this might be it. It's either this or the portrait of George Washington on the dollar bill, this one here, which we'll come back to in just a second. If you think about this image, what do you see? Well, we have an old man here who's holding a pitchfork, wearing a sport coat and overalls, and kind of a banded collared shirt. Now, certainly that shirt and the overalls are the standard operating attire of the Midwestern farmer. When I moved to Maryville, Missouri, and I was there for 9 months, there was only a grocery store and a Walmart. And it wasn't like one of the super fancy Walmarts with groceries. You had to, or was it? Oh, it totally was. I usually bought my groceries at the Hy-Vee, but when I went to the Walmart, I had a running game with myself, and that was I counted the men wearing overalls every day. I'd like walk into Walmart and like, today I think I'm going to see 9 of them. And Maryville was a town of 8,000, and it was the biggest place for 60 miles. And so people all drove to this town of 8,000 to go to the Walmarts. And because they all lived in the middle of nowhere, they were all farmers or what have you, they all wore overalls, right? So he's been shown with a jacket on and overalls, carrying a pitchfork. And if we were to look at this face, I don't know how we would describe him. How about serious, dour? You think this guy knows any knock-knock jokes? No, he doesn't. Not only does he not know any knock-knock jokes, he doesn't care that you do. Try to tell this guy a joke. Knock, knock, who's there? Oh, who? Ohio! He doesn't laugh, right? And also because it's not funny. So, character number one, old guy. This guy right here, or guy, woman here. Let's start with this. What is she wearing? She's wearing very old, antiquated, kind of traditional clothing, right? She's got like this doily on around her, this white collar, the black top, and she's wearing a cameo, for crying out loud. Cameos, even in 1930, were considered kind of quaint and old. So she also, I mean, again, any knock-knock jokes out of her? No, ma'am, no jokes. Thank you very much. What about ages? I mean, let's think about the relationship between these two. How old is he and how old is she? And thereby, what is the relationship? So I always get into trouble when I ask students how old they think people are because they have no idea. But if you were to ask how old this guy is, and I don't know, let's say 65. I mean, my dad's 69. He kind of looks like this. And how about her? Because she doesn't really have any gray hair yet. There's not really hair color in the way in which, like, you would be using it if you were in your 40s or 50s. Um, so I would suggest to you that she's not 65, she's not 55, she's not 45. I would guess that this woman is 40, give or take. So if he's 65 and she's 40, is it possible that they're married? Sure. Is it also possible that he's father and daughter? That seems pretty possible, doesn't it? And they're actually portraits of people that Grant Wood knows, right? Grant Wood is from Iowa. He's actually from Iowa City, or works in Iowa City at this time. This was his dentist, and this was his sister, dentist and sister. So they've been put together for just compositional reasons. They're not, they're just types, really. They're not portraits. Um, let's talk about the architecture. What do you see on this side? We have what looks to be a red farmhouse, right? Or maybe like a barn, red. Over here, we have a house. We have a front porch. It's kind of hard to make out, but right there, there's a plant in a pot, and the leaves are long. And a couple years ago, I had this running joke that we called these Iowa plants because they show up in all of these Grant Wood paintings. But look at the window between them. Like, what kind of window is that? Where have we seen windows like this before? Because if you've been alert and awake and I've managed to keep you engaged, you might remember that there are three characteristics of Gothic architecture: flying buttresses, stained glass, and pointed arches. And this, my friend, is a lancet window from a Gothic church. So it's where we get the title American Gothic. This is not a painting of New York or LA or Chicago. This is a painting of Iowa. And so Grant Wood, as an artist, is interested in depicting the things that are around him, but then capturing it in a way that is almost heroicizing. Maybe 8 years ago or so, I did an exercise in a class when we were talking about this, and in asking a group of mostly students, mostly from Iowa, but everyone who is living in Iowa, I asked them to come up with a list of descriptions of people from Iowa. So they're all from Iowa. What do you think? How would you describe people from Iowa? And it was entertaining, and it also speaks to our own internal prejudices, right? People in Iowa are hardworking, faithful, loyal, and all these things are complementary. And I was like, okay, good. Let's think about people from New York City. And they're like busy, uh, selfish, rude, lazy. And I was like, wait, our people are both lazy and too busy? They work all the time and they're too lazy? But the idea is that what Wood was trying to do was taking pictures or taking an image that is Iowa in, and then show it to a group that's not from Iowa as a way of promoting or elevating it. There is something about the Midwestern work ethic, right? And I know people who work in DC law firms who work 80 hours a week. It's kind of hard to call them lazy, but that's a different kind of thing than being a farmer. So Wood is trying to elevate that, and he does some of those things in really amusing, entertaining kinds of ways. Um, his Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, I think, has this simplistic cartoonish element about it that I just totally dig. Um, there's a poem written in the middle part of the 19th century by Longfellow, uh, and I don't know that I can remember all of it, but it's something like, well, I can't remember any of it, but it's like, listen, my friends, and listen, dear, of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Paul Revere is maybe a name or even an image because of the famous John Singleton Copley portrait. But between Revere's death and the Longfellow poem, Revere wasn't a very commonly known person, and it elevated him into fame. And this is an image that shows him riding from Old North Church to alert the militia that the British are coming. Here they are, one if by land and two if by sea. So here they come. This is a unique depiction of the American West. And he also does something true here with Parson Weems' fable. This is a funny image if you kind of know what you're looking at. And so I give you this little kid here with George Washington's head on it. And this is George Washington's father, allegedly, who is pointing to George and say, "Hey, George, have you chopped down my cherry tree?" And this comes from an early biography of George Washington, largely invented, written by a guy named Parson Weems. And there's like a famous story in that in which, George goes to chop down the cherry tree, and his father comes out and says, "Hey, George, did you chop down the cherry tree?" And you know the magic line, don't you? "Father, I cannot tell a lie." It's all invented. George could tell a lie. Parson Weems could tell a lie because because this never actually happened. George Washington's father died when he was a wee little kid. But this is kind of funny because here's this cherry tree, doesn't look anything like a cherry tree. The father holding it down and him pointing to George and George pointing to the axe is like, not my fault, Dad. Axe did it. And here we have this self-portrait of Grant Wood pulling back the drapery to show this scene as if it's a stage setting. And what Wood has done was sort of taken two great paintings from the history of American art, Charles Wilson Peele's The Artist in His Museum and the Gilbert Stuart Athenaeum portrait, and combined them together. So here you have the artist pulling back this creation, and here you have the image of George Washington, and here you have it together. Regionalism doesn't always have to involve the American Midwest or rural life, because Edward Hopper is every bit of a regionalist, but the region he shows is different than that of the American Midwest. Although Chicago is part of that, it's certainly urban and not rural. And what you're looking at here is a depiction, a painting called Nighthawks. It is a nighttime painting of a cafe, like a diner at night. And the diner is filled with four people, brightly illuminated. We have our diner worker, the man in the white with the hat, a single man sitting with his back to us, and then a man and a woman, 20s, 30s, I don't know, looks to be the worst first date in the history of first dates, sitting at this diner, looking out into our space with a sense of solitude or loneliness. You get the idea. This might be a first date, but ain't gonna be a second date. That the idea that in a world, in a city filled with people, and motion and activity and energy, there still could be loneliness, solitude, and desolation. This nighttime scene, the diner brightly illuminated, the rest of the street and the corner much more dim, sort of speaks to what Hopper perceived the loneliness of modern life. Um, think about our own world, right? The we now have the ability to stay connected with people in a way in which we never did before, right? Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all of that nonsense. But it's hard to make the claim, isn't it, that we have better friends now than people did 30 years ago, right? I mean, every generation thinks it's better than the generation that came before it. But as someone who had a pre-Facebook life, I don't know that I have better friends now. Actually, I'd say my best friends now are friends I have from college, and I was in college before Facebook got around to our neck of the woods. And so Hopper is acknowledging the loneliness that can exist in a city filled with 2 million people. And that idea of loneliness and desolation will be something that we will talk about now. I give you a photograph. The photograph is by an American photographer by the name of Nina Lean, and she was a photographer for Life magazine. Now, you probably have no idea what Life magazine was, but during the middle two decades of the 20th century, there was nothing more important to the fiber of American life than Life magazine. It chronicled all of the great happenings of the American experience. And this was an article published in 1951 that chronicled a group of New York painters because the things they were doing during this time frame were so different, revolutionary, and made people so angry that Life magazine ran an article about it. The name of the photographs is the Rascals. And if you're looking for a good SAT word, actually it showed up on my SAT, the word irascible. An irascible is a person who deliberately tries to annoy somebody else. Um, this was those people. And I want to call your attention to a few people we're going to look at. This guy right here, this is Jackson Pollock. Usually he has one hand on a bottle of scotch, another hand holding a cigarette, and another hand holding a paintbrush. He's like the meanest drunk of the group. This guy right here is Mark Rothko. Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock are the two most important abstract expressionist art makers we can look at. And I'll also show you a third guy just because I think he's kind of cool. We'll look at Willem de Kooning, and this is him right there. Willem de Kooning. He's actually Dutch, but he's working in New York. This image, which I return to now, aptly illustrates the two different branches of abstract expressionism. So let's talk about those two words, abstract expressionism. Abstract, you know about. Abstraction is the breaking of form down to their most recognizable elements. And expressionism is using the tools in the artistic toolbox as a way of creating an emotional experience. So we can think about art as being an expressive thing for those who make it. There are two major branches of abstract expressionism. The first branch is identified by Jackson Pollock. We call it action painting. And the reason why it's called action painting is that Pollock quite literally would dance around the composition when making it. The other is, color field painting. And it's most emblematic of the work of Mark Rothko. Mark Rothko was born in Russia, immigrated to the United States when he was a wee little tyke. And these two forms come to dominate the 1950s and into the 1960s, but it takes us a little while to get there. So I want to look at a couple of Jackson Pollock works to show you what he was working on early on and why where he got to was so important. Pollock was born in the American West. He's from Cody, Wyoming. He was born in Wyoming. He lived in California, lived in Arizona. And if you were to ask him, like, where are you from? He would say, I'm from the West. And the West is distinct from New York. But he eventually ends up in New York and studies at the Art Students League with our boy, Thomas Hart Benton. And again, Thomas Hart Benton is a regionalist. And so it's not surprising that as an artist, he is all about encouraging Jackson Pollock to continue along the artistic path that explores where he's from. Although they might have been part of different regions, the far west for Pollock and the Midwest for Benton, you can see early on that Pollock is embracing and encouraged to depict the American West. There's a kind of nostalgia about this, isn't there? You have the covered wagon, they're going westward, you have like cowboys, it seems, and all of those trappings of Western arts. But as time goes on, Pollock becomes more and more interested in abstract, non-representational works. And what you're looking at here is a painting from a few years later called Male and Female. And in order to sort of understand this composition, we have to talk a little bit about what a train wreck Jackson Pollock was as a human being. Um, Jackson Pollock had a remarkably heavy drinking problem. By all accounts, was a mean and angry drunk, pleasant enough when he was sober, but he wasn't sober enough. And through the intervention of some friends, Pollock was encouraged to seek out some professional guidance for all of his problems. And so he began seeing a psychotherapist. Now, we didn't really talk about Sigmund Freud, and I'm sorry, we'll have to go about our days. But Sigmund Freud, who was the founder of modern psychoanalysis, had a pupil by the name of Carl Jung. Jung is spelled Jung. Carl Jung. And Carl Jung, as a psychotherapist, believed in something called the collective subconscious. And the collective subconscious, quite simply, is the belief that human beings, regardless of when we lived or where we lived, we all share some similar things. We all end up believing in gods, like a god. We all search out understanding for where we came from, right? So you might say, I'm an atheist. I'm like, yeah, you've decided to be an atheist. Humankind all throughout history has developed religion, right? All of them. So that's something human. Even cultures that don't interact with one another. For example, the Egyptians and the people in Mesoamerica both have gods for the sky, and not because they talked about it, right? So according to Jung, this would be the kind of thing that we share, the collective subconscious. We also have an interest in building pyramids. You know, it sounds kind of crazy, right? But the Egyptians have pyramids. The Mesoamericans have pyramids. There are cultures in India and Thailand that have created pyramids. So we all love, right? There are all of these things that we share. We can call them human traits, and this for Jung was the collective subconscious. Now, Freud believed that by letting someone babble, or letting them describe their dreams, he can get to the elements of their unconscious. For Jung, it was something similar, but he believed that you can get to the unconscious by doing something so easy and everyday that you kind of lose track of what you're doing, and your mind becomes to be free. And so while in his 30s, Jackson Pollock was seeing a Jungian trained psychotherapist, and he encouraged Pollock to use art as a way to free his unconscious, and Pollock began to do that. So art for him became a kind of process. Um, the process was greater than the product, and that seems like a crazy idea, but I'll try to explain it to you. The canvas you're looking at now, which is at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., is a large canvas. It's probably 8 foot by 6 foot. And Pollock would take the canvas, roll it on the floor, and he would grab in one hand a can of paint, in the other hand like a 3-inch paintbrush, maybe a stir stick. In his other hand, he would have a glass of scotch, and in the other hand, he would have a cigarette. And he would take the paint, stir it with the stick or with the paintbrush, and then proceed to fling it on the canvas. And in doing so, it became a kind of rhythm. And you can find videos of this on YouTube. I mean, Google search Jackson Pollock action painting, and you will see the ways in which this flinging of paint on the canvas becomes like this rhythmic sort of dance. And he would stir and he would fling and he would move and he would stir and he would fling. And you can't even see me right now, but I've got on Bluetooth headphones and I'm walking around my office stirring and flinging. And he would do this for hours, and the process of it freed up his mind. He would do that for a while and he'd say, okay, time to go to beige. And he would grab the paint and stir and fling. And the paint he's using is the cheapest paint you can imagine. It's house paint. My goodness, like I say this as someone who's painted a bedroom upstairs, in the not too distant past. I bought, pretty good paint. It was $50 a gallon. I can guarantee you can drop $50 at Hobby Lobby for oil paint with 2 tubes. There's no doubt about it. Like, you can go buy some cobalt blue. That could be 50 bucks right there. And so he's using the cheapest paint you can imagine. And he's not even using real paintbrushes. He's using things you would paint a fence with, or a stir stick. And he's doing this, and he goes about it for hours and hours and hours. And he said again and again, like, when I'm doing this, I have a sense of who and what I am. Like, something happens, I know what I'm doing. The process for him was greater than the work of art. The process was a kind of therapy for him. And inevitably, what happens is somebody says this sentence, and to put all the cards on the table, my friends, I'm not a huge fan of Jackson Pollock. This isn't the kind of paint or painting I particularly enjoy. But when anyone ever says that they can do that, or more insultingly, their third grader can do that, I usually say the following: you're either a liar or an idiot, because I will give you $1,000 if you can go do this and come back tomorrow. if you've ever seen the movie Pollock, it stars Ed Harris. Um, Ed Harris was a Pollock fan. He studied for 8 years in order to do what Pollock did. This is not merely throwing paint on a canvas. And not only that, oh my goodness, I don't have my xylophone here. I wish I did. Not only that, just because you can do something that someone has done before doesn't make you the same as that person, right? I can sew a button on. I've done it before. I can't invent the buttonhole. Whoever invented the buttonhole is a smart dude or woman, right? Like to invent something is really, really amazing. To copy what someone did, whoop-de-doo. So you might be able to do what Pollock did, but you can't invent it. That's a really important part. And I pause here again, reiterate, you can't actually do it. The fascinating part about this is that for Pollock, and for those around him, it was often the case that the process was more important than the object. Now, it's sort of complicated for Pollock, right? Because he can't sell a process, right? You don't make money off that. You don't make money off the act. You actually have to sell the thing. But for Pollock, he needed to have an object in which to sell, but he did. And this object was the first one. It's why it's called number one. And what's odd about this is on this canvas, which hangs in the National Gallery of Art, over here somewhere is a cockroach because it walked onto it at night while the paint was still wet and it got stuck. And over here somewhere is a cigarette butt because it fell out of Pollock's mouth. And he never picked it up. Think about this. At no point during this class have we ever looked at a painting where the making of the painting was more important than the painting itself. And at no point have we moved so far away from representation. We could go back to Whistler. Remember Whistler's number one, Symphony in White number one, the white girl? He's like, yeah, it's really not about any narrative. It's just about form. And you're like, come on, James, tell me about the girl. Like, no, it's not about the girl, it's just about form. And you're like, I don't believe you. And then we look at this, and what do we have? What's our narrative? Like, even the most creative of you can't look at this and come up with a story. There's no narrative, it's all gone. This is abstract and painted expressively. If you thought I was joking about Pollock in the canvas, here you go. Not pictured is the cigarette and the bottle of scotch. So he does things like this. And all of that's really, really important. So let's think about Rothko. Mark Rothko is a color field painter. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is the ways in which our bodies physiologically respond to color. Like, you might not think this is true, but it is. I mean, science says so. And so Pollock, or I beg your pardon, Rothko, was kind of fascinated with what happens when you put a person in front of a painting with super bright saturation or things that are less so. Like, what happens? And one of the things he found out was that if he, and these paintings are big, they're 8 feet tall, they're 6 feet wide, they're pretty enormous, that if he constructed a canvas of colors that one might consider soothing or soft. Imagine a nice sea foam green and a light blue. If you stood in front of that painting, right? And you kind of have to stand in front of it and just look at it. He learned something, and this is kind of an easy thing to test because we can hook people up to EEG machines and whatnot. He learned that the human body would calm down, that respiration would go down, that your heart rate would go down, your blood pressure would drop by standing in front of a color that one deemed peaceful. And you might be thinking, well, what is peaceful to one person might be peaceful to another. And I would suggest to you that this is not the case, that we respond to colors in a remarkably human kind of way. And I'll give you an example of this. And I can't do it because I'm in my office at Louisiana Tech University. Today is the 1st of August, and you're far away somewhere else on a different day. But if we were in a class together, and I've been doing this for at least 10 years, I would do the following. I would give you a series of emotions, and I would ask you to assign a color to them. I've been doing this a long time, and every single time it's worked out in a way that has shocked and surprised the students in the classroom. So I'm going to give you some emotions that I traditionally pick, and then after I go through them, I will give you the colors that students often assign to them in such a way that it is consistent. Okay, here we go. Anger. Think of a color. Anger. I'll go crazy. How about happy? Think of a color. Let me write these down. Anger, hunger, no, angry, happy. I like that. Hungry. Think of a color for hungry. Let's go with love. I like that, love. How about tired? Sadness. I guess that's good. All right. Angry, happy, hungry, love, tired, and sadness. Those are our emotions. Your job is to think up colors for all of those emotions. So I don't know exactly how this is going to be delivered to you. Maybe you're in a classroom with a bunch of people. If you are, get ready. Here we go. Raise your hand if you had red or a color like it for angry, because that often happens. What about happy? What color? Raise your hand if you had something like yellow or orange. And you might say, and I would say, well, why? And you're like, smiley faces are yellow. Yep, why? And the only answer anyone's ever given me that makes any sense is like, the sun's happy or the sun's yellow. Like, okay, it's actually not yellow, but okay. But you ever had a sunburn? You're not happy that day, are you? But you think yellow is happy. How about this? Hungry. Haha. Haha. You think I didn't get you. Hungry. Raise your hand if you have either orange or green. And right now, you're probably looking at one another going, wow, that's crazy. I had no idea. I've done this so much. I know what many of you are going to say. And you might think, why? And the answer is, I don't know why. But everywhere I've lived, except for Louisiana, there's a restaurant called Village Inn. I love Village Inn because I need to get an omelet some nights. The whole place is orange and green. Like they're and kitchens orange and green. They're like hungry. Love. What do you got? How about red? Raise your hand. Interesting. Love on one end of the emotional spectrum, anger on the other end of the emotional spectrum, and we often assign the same meaning, same colors to them. How about this? Tired. Tired. What do you think? Do you have something desaturated or light, like gray, light purple? That's often a color that gets to tired. And the last one I'll give you is sadness. How many of you have something like blue? Now, you might say, but Brian, stop it. We have a saying in English, like, I feel blue, and it means sadness. I'm like, you're right, you do. But can I tell you what? I've done this in Germany and Poland. That saying does not exist in either of those languages, nor is it the kind of thing you would necessarily know about when English is not your first language. And both of those places also think sad blue. So what this, I hope, demonstrates in some weird way is that color affects our bodies in a kind of guttural way. And that guttural, if we see red, bright red, and we think anger or love, either of them get your heart rate up, right? Sometimes at the same time, then it's not surprising that when we stand in front of a bright red painting that our body will physiologically change with that. That 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 our and again, it's you might not think about these things, but I do all the time. Our heart rate and our respiration are inherently tied together, right? Because your body needs X amount of oxygen when you're sitting down. Um, But if you start walking around, you need more oxygen. So two things have to happen to accommodate that increased need for oxygen. One, your heart needs to beat faster so that more blood is pushed through your circulatory system. And secondly, your respiration needs to speed up to accommodate that need for more oxygen. So Rothko, in these large-scale compositions, is playing with the idea of manipulating you as a viewer in terms of color, that a big light blue and light green composition will cause you a moment of peace and calm and relaxation. And the image on the left hand or the right hand side, lovingly called orange, red, and blue, might do a different thing physiologically to you. And this change, this shift, is the primary goal of Rothko's color field painting. I said to you a long time ago that art makers can manipulate us, and they can, right? They can lead our eye somewhere, they can make us buy something, and Rothko actually proves that he can take a hold of your somatic nervous system, things that you can't control, and he can tweak it the way he wants to. As we move from the 1950s into the 1960s, we're going to shift our gears a little bit. We're going to stop looking at the abstract expressionists and we are going to put our attention into the pop artists, people like Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, Richard Hamilton, and then we're going to close things up by looking at the environmental artists. When the paintbrush and canvas is going to be replaced by rock and bulldozer. That is coming up next.